All right, now we're all ready to solve the monopoly problem. So we determined the marginal revenue of the monopoly from the inverse demand. We determined the marginal cost of the monopoly from its total cost, and now we just need to identify what quantity price combination will maximize the monopoly's profit. Here we have a simple condition similar to those we used previously to determine the optimal output for a firm under perfect competition or to determine the optimal number of workers that a firm should hire. Basically, we need to compare the marginal revenue of producing each additional unit against its marginal cost of production. And you can see the marginal revenue lives on the red line. The marginal cost belongs on the yellow line. And so for the first units of output, marginal revenue is high and marginal cost is low. And so it definitely makes sense to produce when the red line is above the yellow line. But once they intersect, beyond the intersection, this relationship switches. So costs start to exceed the revenues. And so clearly once you go past the intersection, you start losing money by producing more. It costs you more to produce than it generates in terms of additional revenue. And so the condition here is, well, produce as long as each additional unit of output is profitable. So stop exactly when the profitability, additional profitability of output equals its additional cost. So a monopoly would stop where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And we can find that quantity two different ways. Either you can plot things in Excel, and if your graph is fine enough, that means that if it contains enough different quantity values, you will be able to see at what quantity the intersection happens exactly. So you can see that in my graph that intersection takes place at quantity equal to 10. Alternatively, you can solve the equation by setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, solve it for quantity. That should give you the same quantity of 10. And this is the profit maximizing quantity. And notice that in that quantity of 10, marginal revenue and marginal costs are the same at $60. But the important fact here is that the monopolist would not price its output at 60. It only uses marginal revenue and marginal cost to determine the profit maximizing output, but to determine the price, it needs to go back to the demand function and see what price it can set to sell 10 units of output. So taking this profit maximizing quantity of 10 and plugging it into the inverse demand function gives us the price of 120 minus 30, $90. So that means that the monopolist, to maximize the profit, will produce 10 units and price it above the marginal cost. So it will first determine that 10 units is the optimal output to be produced, but to price it, it will go back to the blue demand curve rather than look at what the marginal cost is going to be. So this is kind of a two-step procedure. And in the first step, you find the optimal quantity. And in the second step, you go back to the inverse demand equation to find at what price you'll be able to sell that quantity. Now let's calculate the profit of the monopolist. Profit is total revenue minus total cost. The total revenue part is just price times quantity. And we just figured out that the monopolist would sell 10 units at the price of 90. So total revenue will be 90 times 10. And we need to calculate the total cost of 10 by looking at the total cost equation. And the only thing that we need to be careful here with is that you can see that in the total cost, all terms are positive, but because in the calculation of profit, we're subtracting the total cost, all terms will have to come with a negative sign in the profit calculation. So we have $900 of total revenue, minus 250, minus 40 times 10, and minus 10 squared. We're subtracting all the costs from the total revenue. And that means that we will be left with a profit of 900 minus 750, which is $150 of profit. One last observation here. So you can see that for a monopolist to maximize the profits, it will produce until marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We can compare that monopolist's decision to produce a 10 with what would be the efficient output in this market, in the sense that, well, the monopolist is solely concerned with their profit, and so they will stop producing where their profit is maximized. But when we think in terms of efficiency, we think, well, would it create additional value to produce an additional unit of output? And the answer is yes, it would to a certain extent. And so, for instance, what about the 11th unit of output? If you look at the inverse demand, buyers are willing to pay slightly under $90 for the 11th unit of output. Exactly, that would be an $87. This is how much you would pay for the 11th unit as a buyer in this market. The marginal cost of producing that 11th unit to the monopolist is only $62. So that means that there is additional $25 in value that can be generated by producing that 11th unit. But the monopolist does not do that because, all in all, that will reduce the monopolist's profit. But if we ask ourselves, what is the efficient output here? Efficiently, it would make sense to produce as long as the amount that buyers are willing to pay, the demand price, which belongs to the blue line, exceeds the cost of producing the additional unit of output. So it would be efficient to produce to the point where price, that means the demand, and marginal cost intersect. That intersection takes place at the quantity that solves inverse demand equal marginal cost. So that corresponds to quantity of 16 and marginal cost equal to the price equal to 72. Let's mark that on the graph. So that means that relative to the efficient output, the monopoly produces fewer units, 10 rather than 16, and charges a higher price, 90 rather than 72. And this is why monopolies tend to be heavily regulated, and usually new monopolies are prevented from being created. We don't want a company that is too inefficient and produces too little and charges too much relative to what could have been produced to maximize the total value in that market. I'm going to stop at this point, and in the last video, I'm going to talk about the monopoly market power and how we can measure it. Thank you.